Thank you to the Historical Society. Thank you to Judge Rosenblatt and Judge Walker, Marilyn Marcus for organizing this event, this conference. As Judge Rosenblatt mentioned, I'm International Director of Restitution at Christie's, where for the last 15 years, I've led our global efforts to tackle the ongoing challenge presented by identifying artworks and objects spoliated during the Nazi era and their continued circulation on today's art market. I'm delighted to be here today to talk about the role Christie's and the art market play in resolving Nazi-era issues and claims. You'll hear from my fellow panelists about the role litigation can play in art claims, but I'd also like to highlight how in our work, practical steps and a soft law approach also have a place in finding fair and amicable resolutions. Given the extraordinary costs, risks, and delays that often come with litigation, we at Christie certainly believe it's best for the parties to a dispute involving a Nazi-era spoliation to take every opportunity to attempt to work out a voluntary compromise settlement. At Christie's, as I'll explain, we've developed a way of working with consignors and claimants based on internationally agreed guidelines like the Washington Principles of 1998, which I'll come back to and which Sharon described. It's a way of working which reflects our role as an intermediary between Christie's clients, buyers and sellers of artworks on the one hand, and families seeking to recover their former possessions and lost inheritance on the other. Because Christie's generally does not own the art that we handle, we can mediate the dispute between the actual parties. This is a fundamental difference between our work and that of some of my colleagues here on the panel, who are usually advocates for a single party involved in a dispute. But neither are we judge in these cases. We can only use our good offices with the express agreement of the parties to assist them in reaching an agreement and a resolution. It's self-evident that the art market, Christie's, other auction houses, dealers, museums, collectors need to be constantly vigilant and alert to restitution issues. There are considerable legal, commercial, and reputational risks if we misstep. But more than that, there's also a clear need for an ethical, moral, and sensitive approach to restitution, one that is embedded in our business practices and our role in the art market. We at Christie sell tens of thousands of artworks each year. The art market is a key net for catching looted art and gives us an almost unique position to contribute to the work of restitution. We're really on the front lines. We receive and must respond to dozens of claims each year, and in many cases, we're the ones to find possible signs of looting, causing us to initiate the resolution process. We look at thousands of items each year across nearly all categories of art, paintings, drawings, books, furniture, porcelain, books. To vet these lots, we have an experienced team with considerable knowledge and expertise and a body of information and documentation that has grown over the last 20 years and that continues to grow. We have also sensitized our specialists to alert the restitution team when a potential issue arises. In any given case, we might use up to a dozen online looted and stolen art databases or sources to help us. When we identify a potentially problematic item, we research it until we can draw a conclusion about its status, or we've made a reasonable assessment of the risk involved in selling it. The work is difficult and time-consuming, as Sharon described also a bit. A painting's appearance can change with lots of restoration. There may be a lack of tangible history for more financially modest works of art, such as works on paper, which historically had limited market value, but may be viewed as something very desirable these days. Or quite simply, there's a risk of confusion because a work's original description is vague and art is frequently created multiple similar works. Because many of the databases we use are active and being updated, because numerous private archives remain still unavailable for research, and finally, because the research results can be subject to differing interpretations, a work thought to be clear of potential issues at one point in time can later be found to in fact be problematic when new information comes to light, or vice versa. The restitution cases we deal with on a day-to-day basis, and this can include cultural property disputes as well as claims of Nazi-looted art, are generally for artworks that are in private hands. Not often are they in museums. Many of the artworks we would all deem problematic are not clear-cut cases, so there are a great number of obstacles to overcome in convincing private collectors or private entities to deal forthrightly with an issue. This is often a difficult process, particularly if there's a sale in progress and the collector faces a potential financial hit. And many collectors who bought artworks in good faith and possess them for some time believe that they have good title and don't recognize it as their personal responsibility to make amends for the past. In such cases, we have to try to find strategies to overcome this reluctance so that difficult cases don't all become protracted lawsuits. In this way, Christie's has resolved or turned over about 40 artworks in the last 5 to 6 years, and we've handled over 200 claims since 1998. Christie's approach is based on the spirit of what has become known as the Washington Principles. These principles, as Sharon described, were devised in 1998 when the international community, governments, lawyers, and practitioners from 44 countries convened in Washington for what would become a seminal conference on Holocaust-era assets. 20 years on, and the legacy of the conference has taken many routes. The creation of national bodies in several countries tasked with reviewing their national and institutional collections, litigation and legislation which has tested fundamental principles, which others on the panel will certainly discuss, and also the development of alternative dispute resolution or soft law approaches that I mentioned. The Washington Principles were reiterated in a slightly expanded form in the Terezin Declaration, which came out of the 2009 Prague Conference on Holocaust-era assets. We at Christie's also made public our own guidelines for dealing with Nazi-era issues and claims that same year. We remain the only auction house to have done so. The Washington Principles established the litmus test that resolutions to claims should be just and fair. A key consideration was to recognize a lighter, more relaxed standard of proof of ownership placed on second and even third generation family members, given the passage of time and the real difficulty of documentation after the turmoil, chaos, and the losses of the war and Holocaust. In many respects, the principles have been successful. They've provided an impetus for our own art restitution efforts and a lens through which we viewed claims handling and art restitution. But what we underestimated at the Washington Conference was the scale and the scope and the complexity of the challenge that lay ahead of us and still does. 20 years ago, when the Washington Principles were drawn up, we all thought in terms of Nazi confiscation. Today, our understanding of restitution claims mean we're not only just looking for artworks that were clearly confiscated or recorded by Nazi looting units like the ERR, the Eisenstahlreichsleiter-Rosenberg, which Sharon also mentioned, but we must also consider whether something may have been sold under duress because persecuted individuals became impoverished and needed money to pay flight taxes, for example, or to fund a new life beyond the Nazis' reach. To give you a flavor of our work at Christie's, I want to take a few minutes to share a couple of recent cases with you. We've worked successfully with a family in the United States who are unwitting holders of this problematic Egon Schiele. After the drawing was consigned to Christie's, our team identified the drawing as having once been in the collection of Dr. Heinrich Rieger, who was a major Schiele collector in pre-Anschluss Austria. Following the Nazis' arrival in Austria, Dr. Rieger was forced to sell off his collection to raise funds and had hoped to emigrate. Unfortunately, he was deported. We explained the drawing's ownership history to the consigner, a family who was sensitive and responsive to the problem and open to dialogue on how best to resolve the claim for its return to the Rieger heirs. We are fortunate to work on both sides with people willing to find a fair and amicable resolution. The drawing was successfully sold last week pursuant to a settlement agreement. A slightly more unusual route for us was the case of this Cunning. The painting was consigned to us from a private collection in Chile. When the painting arrived, it went through the standard cataloging and vetting, and during this process, we flagged it as having been one of the works confiscated during the occupation from the collection of Adolf Schloss in France. The Schloss collection was one of the largest and most important collections in pre-war France. After confiscation, the collection was stored at the Führerbau in Munich, where the painting was stolen a second time. With the fall of the regime imminent in April 1945, the Nazi guards deserted, and what followed was a night of looting by local residents. We don't know exactly what happened to the Cunning, but it turned up on the Munich art market in 1952, oddly enough in the hands of Walter Andreas Hofer, who had been one of the key agents for Hermann Goering during the war. Despite his wartime role in the 1950s, he was free to sell this painting to the father of our Chilean consigner. Once our research uncovered this claim, we sought to discuss the matter with the Chilean consigner and begin the process of facilitating an amicable resolution of the claim. Instead, her family encouraged the Chilean prosecutors to bring charges against Christie's. And at that point, we reached out to the FBI Art Crime Unit to investigate the matter further. When the FBI's investigation confirmed our research, the U.S. Attorney's Office commenced a forfeiture action, which neither Chile nor our consignor contested. This led to the full restitution of the painting to the Schloss family at the beginning of April at a ceremony, you see on the slide, at the French consulate here in New York, attended by France's foreign minister and the Schloss family. At Christie's, we're proud of our commitment to Nazi era restitution and our success in resolving issues when we can. I recall at the Washington conference there was much discussion about the likely duration of restitution as a concern and whether sunset clauses would be needed to draw it to an end. In fact, 20 years on, there's no sign at all that this issue and claims are abating. On the contrary, we're busier than ever as issues come up more frequently with the advent of increased accessible information as well as increased awareness of the restitution issue. As these cases continue, questions arise, such as what is the proper definition of a forced sale or sale under duress? How do we provide incentives for private collectors in possession of looted art to come forward and resolve their claims voluntarily, proactively? Again, another perennial topic, how do we centralize, manage, and make accessible information on Nazi-era losses? So to conclude, clearly our restitution is a multifaceted issue because every claim is unique. And rarely do we have complete documentation. And improving our current practices will require the input of many groups: families, advocates, provenance researchers, art dealers, auction houses, legislators, lawyers, acting together with a common interest in mind. For our part, Christie's continues to invest time and effort into upholding best practices, and we continue to develop these to meet the wider ongoing challenge. Thank you.
Great.